Welcome back to the channel where we uncover the darkest mysteries of human nature and the hidden stories behind history's most chilling figures. Today's story takes us deep into the heart of South America, across the misty Andes Mountains, and into the life of a man whose name became synonymous with terror. His name is Pedro Alonso López, a man the world would later call the Monster of the Andes. Born in 1948 in the small Colombian town of Santa Isabel, López's childhood was marked by hardship, neglect, and abuse. His mother, a struggling sex worker raising many children alone, often left him to fend for himself. From the beginning, his world was one of violence and survival, a place where innocence did not last long, and kindness was a rare gift. When he was only 8 years old, an incident would change the course of his life forever. After his mother caught him committing a disturbing act toward one of his sisters, she threw him out of the house. Homeless, penniless, and deeply scarred, Pedro López began living on the streets, a child with no guidance, no safety, and no love. On those cold streets, he became both victim and survivor. He was taken in by strangers, exploited by predators, and learned that the world was a cruel place. Many psychologists later suggested that this period filled with humiliation, fear, and abuse planted the seeds for the darkness that would define his adult life. As he grew older, López's anger turned outward. He began stealing, wandering through cities, and committing crimes that would gradually evolve into something far more sinister. By the time he reached his 30s, López had already crossed national borders, drifting between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. His victims were often the most vulnerable young girls from poor families, often from isolated mountain communities. He would gain their trust with gifts or promises, only to lure them into remote areas from which they would never return. When authorities finally connected the dots, the scale of his crimes defied comprehension. López's chilling confessions would later shock the world, and his story became a grim reminder of how a single life shaped by pain could turn into one of the deadliest killing sprees in modern history. Today, more than 4 decades later, the name Pedro López still evokes fear, fascination, and disbelief, a haunting symbol of what happens when humanity loses its way. To understand the man Pedro Alonso López became, we have to look closely at the broken childhood that shaped him. Born into poverty in 1948 in Santa Isabel, Colombia, López never knew stability or affection. His mother worked the streets to feed her many children, and the young boy grew up surrounded by chaos, a world of shouting, alcohol, and violence. There was no school, no guidance, and no one to teach him the difference between right and wrong. By the age of 8, López had already begun to show signs of deep psychological disturbance. When his mother discovered him engaging in an inappropriate act with one of his sisters, her reaction was brutal. In a moment of rage, she threw him out of the house permanently. That night, the little boy slept on the streets for the first time, unaware that he would never have a home again. This moment, being abandoned and humiliated, would mark the beginning of his descent into darkness. On the streets of Bogotá, young Pedro faced a life most adults could not endure. He begged for food, slept under bridges, and learned to survive by any means necessary, but the streets offered no mercy. He was taken in by a man who promised him shelter, but instead, the man assaulted him. That betrayal, combined with years of abuse and hunger, destroyed what little innocence he had left. From that point on, López developed a deep hatred toward society, especially women, whom he irrationally blamed for his pain and humiliation. When he reached his teens, López joined groups of street criminals, learning to steal and deceive. He later claimed that during these years he felt completely detached from humanity, like an observer of a cruel world rather than a part of it. Many psychologists who studied his case later described him as a child permanently stuck in trauma, unable to feel empathy or guilt. In the following years, his anger and trauma turned into obsession. He began traveling through South America, moving from one city to another, always chasing something he could not name, perhaps control, perhaps revenge. What started as petty theft would soon transform into a pattern of abductions, assaults, and murders that spanned across 3 nations. And as Lopez's crimes escalated, his legend and the fear surrounding his name began to spread through the Andes. As the years passed, Pedro Lopez's early experiences hardened him. He was no longer a frightened child. He had become a young man who trusted no one and believed the world owed him pain. By his late teens, Lopez drifted across Colombia, moving from city to city, often surviving through petty theft, con jobs, and violence. Every encounter, every rejection, seemed to deepen the hatred brewing inside him. At one point, he was taken in by a charitable American family who found him starving on the streets. They offered him food, shelter, and even sent him to school. For a brief moment, it seemed that his life might change. But that hope did not last. Lopez reportedly fled after being abused again by a teacher, confirming his belief that kindness was just another disguise for cruelty. From that moment, he claimed, my heart went cold. In his early 20s, Lopez was arrested for stealing cars and spent several years in prison, an experience that pushed him even further into darkness. While behind bars, he was reportedly assaulted by a group of inmates. He later said that this event was the turning point, the moment he decided that he would never again be a victim. After his release, he hunted down 3 of the men who attacked him and took their lives in revenge. This was the first known instance of murder in his long trail of violence. When he left prison, Lopez began drifting through the mountains and villages of South America, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, always on the move, always alone. He became a ghost, a man who could vanish into the crowd and reappear miles away. Many locals remembered him as quiet and polite, someone who seemed harmless. But beneath that calm surface was a storm no one could see coming. During these years, Lopez began targeting young girls from poor indigenous families, children who often had no one to look for them if they disappeared. He learned how to gain their trust, offering toys or trinkets, pretending to be a kind traveler. But once they followed him, they were never seen again. These crimes would later stretch across hundreds of miles and claim more victims than any serial case in South American history. Lopez's path was set a journey from a neglected child to one of the most feared men in the world. The monster of the Andes was no longer just a name, it was becoming a reality. By the mid-1970s, Pedro Alonso López had become a wanderer with a dark purpose. Traveling through Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, he targeted young girls between the ages of 8 and 12 children from poor villages, often living in isolated mountain regions. They were innocent, trusting, and invisible to the wider world, the kind of victims no one would notice missing right away. Lopez exploited that. He would approach them in marketplaces or near schools, offering them small gifts like candies, toys, or coins. Sometimes he pretended to be a photographer or a missionary, using charm and patience to win their trust. Then he would lure them to a quiet area, an abandoned field, a lonely road, or a hidden ravine. There, the nightmare began. His method was horrifyingly consistent. Lopez confessed that he would strangle his victims quickly, claiming he did not want them to suffer. But his supposed mercy was a mask for control. He often described his crimes with chilling calmness, as if recounting ordinary events. Investigators later said that what made him most terrifying was not just the number of his victims, but the complete absence of emotion when he spoke about them. Authorities across South America were slow to connect the disappearances. Communication between rural police units was limited, and many families were too poor to report their missing children. Some believed their daughters had run away, others thought they would been taken by human traffickers. In reality, the same man was quietly leaving a trail of death across 3 nations. By the late 1970s, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Dozens of little girls had vanished in identical circumstances from villages miles apart. In Ecuador alone, entire communities began living in fear, parents refusing to let their children walk alone, schools cutting hours short, and rumors spreading about a foreign man who took children and never returned. Still, López remained invisible. He changed names, crossed borders freely, and moved like a shadow through the Andes. Local police rarely shared information with neighboring countries, allowing him to kill again and again without detection. He would later claim in interviews that during this period, he felt possessed, driven by something beyond his control. Whether that was an excuse or a confession of madness, no one could be sure. But one thing was certain. By the end of the decade, Pedro López had become one of the most prolific killers the world had ever seen. And yet, the world did not even know his name, not yet. In 1980, fate finally caught up with Pedro Alonso López. After years of hunting across South America, his reign of terror came to an unexpected end in the Ecuadorian town of Ambato, a quiet place nestled between the Andes Mountains. It all began when torrential rains caused flooding and landslides in the area. As the earth shifted, something horrifying emerged from the mud, the bodies of several young girls, all buried in shallow graves. Local police immediately launched an investigation. The townspeople were terrified. They had long whispered about a stranger who roamed the markets, charming children, and disappearing into the countryside. Those whispers turned into panic when the first bodies were found. Police officers began patrolling markets and bus stations, searching for anyone who matched the description. Their efforts soon paid off. López was caught trying to lure another girl away from her mother with the promise of gifts. When the mother grew suspicious and called for help, a nearby market vendor intervened and helped restrain him until the police arrived. At first, López claimed he was innocent, just a traveler misunderstood by locals. But once he was taken into custody, the truth began to surface. During interrogation, López appeared calm and eerily polite. He spoke softly, even smiling at times, but what he confessed left investigators stunned. He admitted to killing dozens of girls in Ecuador, and then, to the disbelief of the officers, hundreds more across Colombia and Peru. He described in detail how he had chosen, abducted, and buried his victims. To prove it, he led police to mass graves in remote areas, and, tragically, his words were true. One by one, the investigators uncovered the remains of missing children in the exact locations López described. The evidence was undeniable. In total, authorities confirmed 53 graves in Ecuador alone, and estimated many more that could not be recovered. His cold recollection of each crime, the precise memory of every site, shocked even seasoned detectives. When news of his arrest spread, it made international headlines. Reporters called him the Monster of the Andes, a name that would follow him forever. But even as the world reacted in horror, López remained strangely detached. "I am the man of the century," he reportedly told journalists. "No one has done what I have done." The case of Pedro Alonso López was no longer a mystery hidden in the mountains. It had become a chilling symbol of evil itself, finally exposed to the world. What came next was one of the most disturbing confessions in criminal history. Once in custody, Pedro Alonso López began talking freely, almost as if relieved to finally tell his story. He showed no remorse, no hesitation, and no sense of guilt. Investigators described him as calm, polite, and disturbingly articulate, as though he were narrating someone else's life, not his own. López told the police that he had killed more than 300 young girls across 3 countries, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He said his victims were mostly between 8 and 12 years old, chosen because they were pure and innocent. He claimed that taking their lives gave him a sense of power and peace, a twisted justification that left investigators speechless. "I looked into their eyes and saw no fear," he reportedly said during questioning, "only trust. That is when I knew they were mine." When pressed for proof, Lopez led the police to the burial sites himself. He took them through rural hills, riverbanks, and empty fields, pointing to the ground with precision, as if retracing a path he had walked countless times before. At each site, officers uncovered skeletal remains, often with the same pattern of injury. His details were too specific to doubt. The total confirmed victims in Ecuador alone reached 53, but his statements suggested many more buried across borders that would never be found. Despite the horrifying scale of his crimes, Lopez seemed to view himself as special, even superior. He told reporters that he saw his killings as a mission, not a crime. At times, he spoke of himself in the third person, as if detaching from what he had done. Psychiatrists who examined him described him as suffering from an extreme form of antisocial personality disorder, a man without empathy, shame, or moral restraint. What shocked the world even more was how openly he shared his story. In interviews, Lopez appeared almost proud of his notoriety. "I am the man who brought fear to the Andes," he said. "I gave them something to remember." His lack of remorse made him one of the most chilling figures in modern criminal history. The confessions turned the investigation into a media spectacle. While authorities struggled to verify the total number of victims, one thing was clear: the man sitting in that interrogation room was unlike anyone they had ever encountered. And as his words echoed through courtrooms and headlines, the world began to question how such evil could exist behind such a calm, human face. When the full scope of Pedro Alonso López's crimes came to light, it sent shockwaves through South America and beyond. The Ecuadorian authorities faced an unprecedented case: hundreds of missing girls, dozens of confirmed murders, and a man who not only confessed but seemed to relish his own infamy. Yet, despite the enormity of his crimes, the justice system at the time was unequipped to handle something of this scale. In 1980, Ecuador had no legal framework for serial killings, and the maximum sentence allowed under its law was only 16 years in prison, regardless of the number of victims. The court convicted Lopez of 110 murders, though he had confessed to many more. Investigators and families were devastated. How could a man responsible for such horror face only 16 years? For many, it felt like justice was slipping through their fingers. The trial itself was chilling. Witnesses recounted the fear that gripped their villages, the disappearances of their daughters, and the day the graves were found. Lopez, sitting calmly in the courtroom, barely reacted. Reporters described him as detached, showing no emotion even as the names of the murdered girls were read aloud. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply smiled and said, "I am sorry for the mothers, but it is too late now." Throughout his imprisonment, Lopez was reportedly a model inmate, quiet, obedient, and helpful to guards. Psychologists who examined him believed he understood exactly what he had done but lacked the capacity for empathy or regret. He spoke about his crimes as if they were simply part of his destiny, claiming that God had forgiven him. By the time his sentence was nearing completion, international outrage began to grow. Human rights groups and journalists questioned how a man dubbed the monster of the Andes could ever walk free again. But the Ecuadorian authorities were bound by law. They could not extend his imprisonment without a new conviction. When Lopez's release date finally arrived in 1994, the world watched in disbelief. He had served less than the maximum 16 years, just 14, due to good behavior. For the families of his victims, it was a second heartbreak. For them, justice had not only failed, it had vanished. Pedro Alonso López, one of the deadliest serial killers in history, was about to step out of prison and re-enter the world a free man. And no one knew what would happen next. In 1994, after spending just 14 years behind bars, Pedro Alonso López walked out of prison calm, quiet, and smiling. His release stunned the world. The man who had confessed to killing hundreds of young girls was now free to walk among the public again. The Ecuadorian justice system had done all it could, but under the laws of that time, even the most horrific killer could not be held any longer. The day he was released, López was immediately handed over to immigration authorities and deported to his native Colombia. Ecuador wanted nothing more to do with him. The officials who had handled his case described the moment as deeply unsettling, a mix of helplessness and dread. They had captured one of history's most prolific killers and then had to let him go. Upon returning to Colombia, López did not face a new trial right away. Although he was suspected of committing dozens of murders there before his arrest in Ecuador, the Colombian police lacked concrete evidence. Many of his alleged victims were poor, rural children whose families had never filed official reports, and records from the 1970s were incomplete or missing entirely. Instead of being tried again, López was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Bogotá for evaluation. Doctors declared him mentally unstable and a danger to society. For a while, it seemed the authorities had found a way to keep him confined, but the sense of relief would not last long. After a few years, López underwent further psychiatric assessments. Doctors eventually ruled that he was sane and fit for release, provided he agreed to regular check-ins with the police and mental health authorities. It was a decision that would later become one of the most controversial in Colombian legal history. In 1998, López was officially released from the hospital under supervised freedom, but almost immediately after his release, he disappeared. He stopped reporting to authorities, vanished from his registered address, and was never seen again by officials. It was as if the monster of the Andes had melted back into the shadows from which he came. For the families of his victims, the news was unbearable. They had spent years hoping justice would finally catch up to him. Instead, they watched as a man who admitted to unspeakable crimes walked free twice, first from prison, then from a psychiatric ward. And from that moment on, the world would never truly know what became of Pedro Alonso López. Only rumors, sightings, and fear that somewhere, somehow, he might still be alive. When Pedro Alonso López disappeared in 1998, it was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. One of the world's most notorious serial killers, a man who had confessed to hundreds of murders, simply walked out of a psychiatric hospital in Bogotá and never came back. Despite being under a conditional release that required him to check in regularly with local authorities, he failed to report after just 1 month. The Colombian police issued a local warrant, but it was too late. López had vanished without a trace. For years afterward, investigators tried to track him. There were occasional sightings, whispers that he'd been seen in small Andean towns, or that he was posing as a preacher in remote villages. Some reports even claimed he had moved deeper into the Amazon, living under a false identity. But none of these leads were ever confirmed. Every trail went cold. Interpol later issued an international notice for his capture, labeling him a dangerous fugitive. But there was a glaring problem. Most countries in South America had no fingerprints, DNA records, or digital databases from the 1980s. In other words, if López changed his name, he could easily blend into society as a nobody. The monster of the Andes had become a ghost. In 2002, Colombian police reopened investigations into unsolved murders that resembled López's methods, young girls disappearing from markets and rural roads. But no physical evidence linked him to those crimes. Then, in 2012, reports surfaced from the city of Tunja, Colombia, about a series of child murders bearing eerie similarities to López's old patterns. Some believed he had resurfaced. Others thought it was a copycat killer inspired by his legend. The truth was never proven. What terrified people most was how possible it was for someone like him to disappear. López was quiet, polite, and unremarkable in appearance. Without digital records, security cameras, or facial recognition, a man like him could cross borders and start over anywhere, and that is exactly what authorities feared he had done. His last confirmed record dates back to 1999, when he visited a Colombian government office to renew his identification card. After that, nothing. No arrests, no documents, no verified sightings, only silence. As the years went by, theories multiplied. Some believed he was dead, killed by someone seeking revenge or by his own failing health. Others believed he was still alive, hidden in plain sight, somewhere in South America, an old man who once terrorized 3 nations. Whatever the truth may be, one fact remains chilling: Pedro Alonso López escaped justice. His name still lingers like a dark echo through the Andes, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters do not vanish into myth. They simply disappear into the world. After Pedro Alonso López vanished in 1998, authorities across South America were left scrambling to contain the fallout. Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia all shared responsibility for his crimes, yet none could confirm his whereabouts. The story of his disappearance made headlines worldwide, sparking outrage that one of history's worst serial killers had simply walked free. In response, Interpol issued an international warrant for López's arrest. His file described him as a highly dangerous offender capable of extreme violence and manipulation. Yet, despite the global alert, there were no concrete leads. López had no digital footprint, no traceable bank accounts, and no known relatives willing to speak publicly. His disappearance was as complete as if he had planned it for years. Forensic analysts at the time warned that López's escape exposed a terrifying truth. South America's law enforcement systems were deeply fragmented. There was no unified database, no shared criminal records between nations, and limited communication between rural police departments. That lack of coordination was what had allowed López to kill undetected for years, and now it was helping him vanish again. Throughout the early 2000s, occasional reports emerged suggesting López might still be alive. In 2002, Peruvian authorities briefly investigated a suspect resembling him after the disappearance of several children near the border, but DNA testing was inconclusive. In 2005, Interpol quietly closed its active notice due to lack of progress, though the case remained open in local databases. Even so, the monster of the Andes became a legend, whispered in law enforcement circles, a case study of how a single individual could expose the flaws of international justice. Experts debated whether López's claims of 300 murders were exaggerated, but even the confirmed numbers were enough to make him one of the deadliest serial killers ever recorded. As the decades passed, journalists revisited his story. Documentaries, crime books, and podcasts tried to answer the same question: how could he have disappeared in plain sight? Some investigators speculated that López might have changed his identity, taking refuge in remote parts of Colombia or even neighboring Venezuela. Others believed he had died anonymously, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the mountains that once concealed his crimes. Yet, the possibility that he might still be alive, living quietly under a new name, continues to haunt those who remember the case. To this day, no government or police agency has ever confirmed his capture or death. Pedro Alonso López remains an open file in the Interpol archives, an invisible shadow in the world's criminal history. The last verified glimpse of Pedro Alonso López came in 1999, just a year after his escape from psychiatric supervision. According to official records, he appeared at a Colombian civil registry office in Bogotá to renew his national identification card. The clerk who assisted him later told investigators that López was polite, calm, and soft-spoken, just another middle-aged man completing paperwork. Nothing in his demeanor betrayed the fact that she was face-to-face with one of the deadliest men in history. After that day, López vanished completely. There were no further records, no banking activity, no government documents, no medical files, and no arrests anywhere in South America. For law enforcement, it was as though he had been erased from existence. The Colombian authorities continued to keep an eye out for him, but every lead ended in disappointment. He had learned how to disappear long before his crimes were ever discovered. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, sporadic sightings were reported. A farmer in rural Ecuador claimed he saw a man resembling Lopez begging for food. A Peruvian police officer insisted that he recognized Lopez preaching in a small village church near the border. Another witness said he saw him living under a different name in Venezuela, selling trinkets in markets, but none of these accounts were ever verified. The lack of photographic evidence and the limitations of communication between small towns made confirmation nearly impossible. By the time journalists revisited the case in the 2010s, Lopez would have been in his late 60s, still physically capable of living independently, but aging. Some criminologists speculated that he might have died quietly, possibly from illness, starvation, or violence. Others were convinced he had assumed a new identity and continued to live among ordinary people, protected by anonymity. There were also darker theories. A few police sources suggested that Lopez might have been killed in secret, either by relatives of his victims or by local vigilantes. In countries where justice often feels distant, such acts of revenge are not uncommon. If that were true, it would explain why his trail ended so suddenly. But the truth remains unknown. No grave has ever been found. No DNA match, no arrest, no verified death certificate. It is as if Pedro Alonso López, the monster of the Andes, simply walked off the edge of the world. And so, his story lingers in silence. Each year, as investigators review unsolved disappearances across the Andes, his name resurfaces a reminder that somewhere out there, a man who confessed to over 300 murders once slipped through the cracks of justice, leaving behind nothing but fear, unanswered questions, and ghosts that still haunt the mountains. Today, more than 40 years after his arrest and confession, the fate of Pedro Alonso López remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. No official record confirms whether he is alive or dead. If still living, he would be in his late 70s, an elderly man, somewhere in South America, perhaps blending into a crowd, perhaps long buried under an unmarked grave. But without evidence, the world can only speculate. Interpol's archives list him as wanted, whereabouts unknown. Colombian authorities have occasionally reviewed the case, especially when new disappearances of young girls occur in rural regions. Yet none of those investigations have ever led to him. It is as if he vanished into thin air, leaving behind only stories, rumors, and the chilling memory of what he once did. Criminologists have long debated whether Lopez exaggerated the number of his victims. The oft-cited figure of over 300 murders remains impossible to verify. Still, the remains of at least 110 girls were confirmed, making him among the deadliest serial killers ever recorded. But numbers alone cannot capture the scale of suffering he caused. In the villages of Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia, generations of families still remember his name. They tell their children, not as a ghost story, but as a warning, a reminder of how evil can sometimes look ordinary, even kind. Modern law enforcement experts often cite Lopez's case as a lesson in systemic failure. Weak communication between nations, lack of centralized databases, and lenient sentencing laws allowed a confessed mass murderer to walk free. His escape exposed the dangerous reality of fractured justice systems and how bureaucracy can sometimes fail to protect the most innocent lives. In the years since, his story has appeared in countless documentaries, books, and university studies. Yet each new retelling circles back to the same haunting question. How could a man who admitted to killing hundreds simply disappear? Some say he died in poverty and obscurity, karma finally catching up to him. Others believe he found refuge in the anonymity of forgotten towns, an old man whose monstrous past no one recognizes. But the most unsettling theory is that he never truly stopped, that somewhere, sometime after 1998, the monster of the Andes may have taken more lives, hidden once again behind the silence of the mountains. To this day, Pedro Alonso López's story remains unfinished, a terrifying chapter of human darkness without closure, without justice, and without an ending the world can accept. The story of Pedro Alonso López, the monster of the Andes, is more than a tale of horror. It is a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of humanity. From a childhood filled with pain and neglect to a life consumed by violence, López's journey reveals how cruelty can breed cruelty when compassion disappears. His crimes left scars not only on the families who lost their daughters, but also on entire nations that learned too late how fragile justice can be. Decades have passed, yet the mystery remains. Did he die alone, forgotten by the world he once terrorized? Or is he still out there living under a false name, a ghost walking among the living? No one knows for sure, and perhaps no one ever will. But one truth endures. The memory of what he did still lingers like a cold wind through the Andes, whispering warnings to those who dare to look back. Stories like this remind us that evil does not always wear a frightening face. Sometimes it smiles, speaks softly, and hides in plain sight. And that is what makes it truly terrifying. Thank you for watching and for walking with me through this dark chapter of true crime history. If you found this story as haunting as I did, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe, because here we uncover the untold truths behind the world's most disturbing mysteries. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, not every monster lives in the shadows. Some once walked among us.